I'm going to introduce our speaker, Chris Carola. So Chris is a native of Mechanicville and a professional journalist. He worked for the AP out of the Albany office for over 30 years. Also, Chris is a published author. He is, I don't know how many books, but I know that he was the author in George S. Bolster's Saratoga Springs, which is a photographic archive record of the Bolster collection here at the museum. So he's done some wonderful work for us here. Chris now works as a communications director for AARP and lives here in Saratoga Springs now. And he's going to do an lecture tonight about one of our regiments from Saratoga Springs that fought in the Civil War, the 77th New York Volunteers. So Chris, here you go. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. And thank you to the fine folks here at the museum. They do great work and educating and telling about our history here at Saratoga Springs. As you know, it's pretty unique. And thank you for what you do, Jamie. I'm going to tell you about the 77th. There was a regiment that was raised in Saratoga County, the 115th. This one was raised first. And as you're going to hear, these guys fought in some of the bloodiest battles and campaigns of the entire Civil War, right until Lee's surrender. So let's find out where they went and who these guys were. They were nicknamed the Bemis Heights Regiment. And the way it worked, when they formed regiments back then, the applications that you had to submit to the state were numbered in chronological order. So they should have been the 45th regiment. There was already a 44th. But the officers in this regiment put in a special petition. Oops, that one?
Yeah, this one keeps cutting out. They worked fine when you try and bring it that way.
How's that one? Oh, much better. They submitted a petition to the governor of New York State saying, hey, we want to be the 77th Regiment in honor of 1777 when the battles of Saratoga were fought over in Stillwater. The first battle was today, 200 and somebody do the math for me, right? And the second one was October 9th, 1777. And they got approval for that, so they became the 77th. And everybody back then would have known Saratoga in 1777, north and south. So it was a pretty unique thing to get that special designation. After I gave this talk for the first time and mentioned that, somebody got a hold of me and said the 69th Regiment of Pennsylvania during the Civil War also got that special permission to get that name, that number, because they were Irish guys, and they wanted to be named after the 69th Regiment of New York, which was part of the original Irish Brigade. So there might be other unique regiments out there, but ours is pretty unique. They mustered into the service of the U.S. Army. At that time, the U.S. Army, a standing professional army, at the time of the Civil War, was about 12,000 men. Most of them were out west of Mississippi, guarding wagon trains going to the West Coast, going to Oregon, occasionally chasing around Native Americans and rarely ever catching up with them. So when the Civil War started, the Union had to put the call out for volunteers. And the 77th became a volunteer regiment. By the end of the war, there was over 200 New York regiments. New York was the most populous state at that time. We had the most men in the Civil War, about 450,000. We also had the most casualties. Over 40,000 men from New York were killed. Tens of thousands of others were wounded. And New York, there were no battles fought here within New York State. However, New York State was a major player during that war, if not the biggest player in the terms of men, like I mentioned, materiel and money. Materiel, the Industrial Revolution had kicked in decades earlier, and New York was at the center of it. So places like New York City, Troy, Buffalo were producing all sorts of things during the Civil War, guns, cannons, clothing, equipment, and food. We were producing a lot of food for the Union Army. Horseshoes. And horseshoes out of Troy, right? Millions and millions of horseshoes came out of Troy, New York, for the cavalry horses and the artillery horses. And then money. The richest people in North America were living in New York City. So New York pretty much financed the Union cause. Plus people of New York donated millions of dollars to benefit the soldiers in the field. The 77th was mustered into the U.S. Army on November 23rd, 1861 for a 3-year enlistment. Oops, sorry. Just to give you an idea, it's probably is no surprise to some of us that the North kept better records during the war than the South. And it shouldn't be a surprise that New York, we're good at records, right? We're good at red tape. So we have some pretty good records on who these guys were. And most of it's online on the New York State Military Museum website, the museum right down the block. Here's the muster in roll for the 77th. And the guy at the top, James McKean, he was a local lawyer, a congressman when the war started. So he was one of the people raising the 77th. And when you put together a regiment, you couldn't just show up at the Union Army and say, hi, Chris Carola, call us Carola's Crusade. I got 1,000 Crusaders. I got 1,000 guys. We want to go fight those rebs. It was a whole process. You had to pass muster. So there were Union officers that would go around to each regiment, make sure you had the right uniforms, the right armaments, the right supplies. And if you passed muster, you got inducted into the Army. And McKean was a major player in getting that started. This is an example of one of the muster rolls. And I don't know if you can see here where these guys were from. Saratoga, old Saratoga, which was Schuylerville before they renamed it Schuylerville. Edinburgh, Stillwater, Bemis Heights, Mechanicville. So soldiers were also enlisted from Essex County in the Adirondacks and Fulton County in the Mohawk Valley. A lot of guys from Gloversville and Johnstown were part of this regiment. One of the, this is not missing on the side, but one of the guys I found interesting was Isaac Bemis from Bemis Heights, Saratoga battlefield area. And I thought, well, maybe he was related to the original settlers over there, and I couldn't find the answer until not long ago. There's a book on the 77th, and sure enough, he was from, his ancestors settled Bemis Heights. Oops, sorry. So late November, they headed down to Albany, got on trains from here and went to Albany. Albany got on steamships to New York City. And in New York City, there were a bunch of Saratogians who had moved down there and started a Saratoga club. And in honor of the 77th being in town, they presented them with a special flag, a regimental flag. And the flag depicted the Saratoga surrender. It was a famous painting of Burgoyne surrendering to Gates at Saratoga. So that was the design of their regimental flag. And each regiment had to have a national flag, which is an American flag, a regimental flag, and a couple other flags, like flank markers, they called them, and guidons. And this was the regimental flag for the 77th, and it's part of the New York State Military Museum's collection of battle flags, which is the largest in the world. Something like 2,000 battle flags. More than half are Civil War regimental flags. From New York City, they went to New Jersey, got on trains, were put in freight cars, which had recently transported livestock and hadn't been cleaned out properly, which made for a very uncomfortable trip for those guys. And they got to the District of Columbia. Regiments from all over the Union states were pouring into the D.C. area in late 1861. And they went into what they called winter camp. Typically, armies back then did not fight during the winter. Here in North America, the main reason was so much the snow, they don't get much snow down there, was the rain. The roads were all dirt roads, or hard-packed dirt, and even a little rain turned them into mud. A lot of rain turned them into quagmires, and you couldn't move. There were campaigns and offenses later in the war that would come to a screeching halt because the horses and mules would get stuck up to their bellies, and you couldn't move the wagons, you couldn't move the ambulances. So they usually went into winter camp, and they used that time to drill, to stock up on weapons and food, medical supplies. And for the 77th, they did that at a place called Camp Hill House in the winter of 1861, 1862. In the spring of 1862, the Union Army heads south into Virginia. The war is on. First major battle they had at Bull Run. Everybody thought the Union was going to kick butt. It's going to be over in a few weeks. That didn't happen. Confederates won that battle. And that was the first indication that this wasn't going to be over anytime soon. The 77th was in the Virginia campaign in 1862 at various places. There was a siege at Yorktown, Virginia. They were part of that. There was a battle outside of Mechanicsville, with an S, not Mechanicville. The 77th was there. And they were losing guys here and there, not many, not suffering many casualties. And that changed in September 1862. Robert E. Lee, the new commander of the Confederate Army, takes his army north, invades the north, goes into Maryland. And the Union Army, commanded by a guy named McClellan, a West Point grad from New Jersey, they're in pursuit, and the two armies meet in a place called Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Union intended to name the battles after the nearest river or creek. There was a creek there, the Antietam Creek. So the Union called it the Battle of Antietam. The Confederates named their battles after the nearest town. They called it the Battle of Sharpsburg. And this was, I don't want to say it's the first indication, it was an early indication on how bloody this war was going to be at Shiloh, Tennessee in April 1862, and what they refer to as the Western Theater. Over here was the Eastern Theater, Virginia, Maryland, and in the Western Theater at Shiloh, tens of thousands of men were killed or wounded. And that was the first real indication that this was going to be very bloody. And Antietam turned out to be even bloodier. The bloodiest single day in U.S. history, over 20,000 total casualties. And this is the 77th was there. They were part of this battle, McClellan's forces, and they suffered 11 killed, 21 wounded in action. This is a famous photo taken by a guy named Alexander Gardner. Matthew Brady, you probably heard his name, famous photographer, Civil War. He was born right up in Warren County, I think in Chestertown. Learned a photography trade down in Troy. And he set up a photography studio in New York City at the start of the war, then moved to Washington. But he had guys that would go out to the actual battlefields. One was Alexander Gardner, another one was Timothy O'Sullivan. And they typically got there a day or two or three after the battles. And by then, you know, these bodies were decomposing, so a lot of these photos were pretty gruesome, and this was pretty shocking to the American public to actually see photos of war dead. Photography was barely 20 years old. There were other battles during 1862, and again, the 77th is there. They're not suffering horrendous casualties, but they are losing guys here and there. And what they're mostly losing guys to is illness and disease. For every Civil War soldier killed in battle, one or two died of disease or illness. And it could be malaria, it could be dysentery, typhus, something like measles. If you caught measles, it wouldn't kill you outright, but it could lead to bronchitis. Bronchitis could lead to pneumonia. Pneumonia was a killer. So Civil War soldiers on both sides died in droves from illness and disease, some of them without ever facing a shot in anger. 1863, campaign starts. They're going after the Confederates. They want to take Richmond. That's like the Confederate capital. So a series of battles start in spring of 1863. One of them is at Bemis Heights at Fredericksburg. There's a battle there in December where the Union troops advanced against entrenched Confederates and got just mowed down by the thousands. The Union went back to about the same area and launched this attack and actually won this battle, but one of the casualties for the 77th was a guy named Luther Wheeler, one of the original officers of the 77th, well-liked, highly regarded. And he was injured and died of wounds. And one of his friends later wrote, "Oh, my good and true Captain Wheeler, he is gone. He was a noble man, and I challenge the service to furnish his equal." Word had gotten back here that he had been wounded. And then people heard he was being brought home, so they went to the train station, which was just up the block. And people were shocked when in fact, a casket was taken off the train that held his body. They didn't know he had died. And they held a funeral here. He's buried over in Green Ridge Cemetery. And thousands of people showed up. Several thousand people showed up at his burial. And there were only several thousand people in the village of Saratoga at the same time. So that tells you how highly regarded he was. And at Fredericksburg, the 77th has taken casualties, 12 killed, 41 wounded in action, 30 MIA. Most of the MIAs would turn out to be prisoners of war, which in a lot of ways was a death sentence because the prison camps were so bad then. In the summer of 1863, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, they head north. They want to do another invasion of the North. They want to draw the Union Army away from Washington. And the armies meet at Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. The 77th was there. They got there on July 2nd, second day of the battle, and they weren't involved in the fighting. They were assigned to protect an artillery battery. But it doesn't mean they were in a safe area. They didn't suffer any casualties, but that doesn't mean you're in a safe place. If you've ever been to Gettysburg or any of these battlefields, Civil War battlefields, they look like wide open spaces, rolling hills, but then you plunk, I don't know, tens of thousands of men in that space, and virtually every one of them is armed with some sort of firearm, a musket, a rifle, a sidearm. And then you throw in cannons, lots and lots of cannons. And so all of a sudden there's a lot of lead flying around. It could be a very small place. In a place like Gettysburg, you could be off hanging out at your bivouac, boiling up some coffee, and a cannonball could come fired from a mile away, could come bouncing through and do some damage. And it did happen there, but fortunately for these guys, they did not suffer any casualties, and they did put up a monument to their service. If you go to Gettysburg, there's tons of North and South monuments to the regiments and the soldiers who fought there. The 77th, the Pickett's charge was repulsed on July 3rd. July 4th, the Confederates retreat back to Virginia. The Union general was criticized, a guy named Meade, George Meade, that he didn't pursue Lee's army and crush it and end the war right then, but Meade's guys were exhausted. It was the middle of the summer. It was hotter than heck. They were exhausted from their fighting. They had suffered thousands of casualties. I think the overall number of casualties at Gettysburg was 50,000. So Lee makes it back to Virginia. The war is still going on. In the meantime, Colonel McKean, he'd fallen ill earlier in the war. And he was sent home to recuperate and wanted to go back to, to serve with his guys, the guys he had started out with, but he was just too sick. And he sent a letter in July after Gettysburg and said, "But brothers, I leave you, prostrated for the third time by chronic disease, contracted in the field. I address you from a bed of sickness to say that it is hard to say farewell. You need no advice now. You know why yon have chosen to be soldiers, brothers of the 77th, farewell." And he was one of, like I said, one of the core group of officers at the beginning, very well liked, very well respected by the rank and file soldiers. So 1863 winds down. They're back in winter quarters again and gearing up and recuperating for the next campaign, which would be in 1864. And in the meantime, one of the soldiers wrote a letter home to the Saratoga, and people were always writing, soldiers were always writing home to their parents, or even right to the papers, telling about life in camp or about the battles. And this is one of the funnier letters. These guys were subsisting on daily rations of hardtack, which was a really hard cracker-type food that they had to boil to soften, and salted beef, which was stored in barrels and was often rancid. So any food they could supplement their diets with, they would, and they would scavenge the local countryside, and evidently they grabbed some chickens and cooked those up. And luckily, the change of diet did them no harm, though some hinted at foul play being connected with the affair. As you can see, this was March 1864. A couple of guys were goofing around. The caption from a book on the 77 said the guy on the left was killed, later killed, and the guy on the right was wounded. I've read where Civil War historians say around this time, you see fewer and fewer of these photos. Earlier in the war, guys would goof around and be photographers around, and they would pose, and they would have to hold that pose because of the technology of the cameras. If you moved, it blurred. So you'll see these guys kind of fake fighting with sabers or doing something goofy. And the historians say around this time, you don't see so many of these photos anymore. Nobody really fell around like goofing around. One, the Army of the Potomac was in the field all the time, and the photography studios tended to be in the bigger towns and cities. And by then, guys they would have goofed around with were dead, or wounded and recovering in a hospital in Washington, or wounded and sent back home and discharged from the service, or they were missing, or they were POWs. So by 1864, you see fewer and fewer of these types of photos. As bad as 1862 was with the Battle of Shiloh, Battle of Antietam, as bad as 1863 was with the Vicksburg campaign out in the Mississippi, followed by Gettysburg, 1864 would be even bloodier, even more horrific. And for several reasons. One of them was Lincoln announced in March 1864 that he had named General Ulysses S. Grant, the victor at Vicksburg, as overall commander of Union armies, not just of the Army of the Potomac, but all Union armies, armies in the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater, where he started out. Grant was born in Ohio, West Point grad, served in the Mexican War with distinction. Stayed in the Army, was sent out west, had a drinking problem, mostly because he was depressed, missed his wife and kids. Got out of the Army, failed at everything he tried in civilian life, and came back into the Army for the Civil War, and was winning battles out west to the point where Lincoln said, I like Grant, he fights, as opposed to these other generals, McClellan and Hooker, who would fight and then, we got to retreat. We got to reform. We got to recuperate. And Lincoln was like, no, keep fighting, keep moving forward. So Lincoln liked the Grant style. And I mentioned 1864 being bloody. It started out in the spring of 1864. Grant's goal was to destroy Lee's army in the field, and he thought that was, and he was right, the only way to stop the rebellion, to bring the country back together. And the first series of battles were called the Battles of the Wilderness in Virginia, and it was a heavily wooded area, weren't a lot of roads, so guys would have to go through the woods, and there was a lot of undergrowth. It was almost like jungle fighting that the GIs went through in the Pacific or even Vietnam. And these regiments would blunder into each other, and sometimes they'd shoot their own guys. This went on for a few days, and as if the battles weren't horrific enough, it was a dry period, and the sparks from the muskets would set forest fires, and the guys that had been wounded couldn't get away. So hundreds of guys burned to death during these battles. The next battle was Spotsylvania Courthouse, another it doesn't get as much, not as well known as Antietam or Gettysburg, but almost just as bloody. And the 77th was there too. And then they were at Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor was a place the Union kept attacking entrenched Confederates and got mowed down by the hundreds. The 77th was there. You can see the increase of their casualties, especially at Spotsylvania. And then they were rushed up to D.C. area. In July, there was a Confederate general named Early who had an army that was threatening to take Washington, and he almost got in. They said if he had gotten in, the defenses were so bad around Washington, he could have marched his army up Pennsylvania Avenue, knocked on the White House door, and asked for President Lincoln. He came close to doing it. 77th got rushed up there to help with that. And then in October and fall that year, they got sent out to the Shenandoah Valley, northwest of Washington. Shenandoah Valley was the Confederate Army's breadbasket, producing a lot of food, keeping the Army fed, keeping the Confederates fed, and in the field. So Grant finally said, all right, go up and chase the Confederates out. And the 77th got assigned to that army, headed that way. And it was a battle. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead here. This is one of the guys that died at the Wilderness Battle. This is his tombstone over also in Greenridge. They didn't bring guys back to bury him all the time here. So I don't know if that's a memorial or if his body's there. Embalming had become a thing right before the Civil War. And the first Union officer to be embalmed and sent home was Elmer Ellsworth, born in Malta, raised in Mechanicsville, was shot and killed, taking a Confederate flag down from a a hotel in Alexandria, Virginia. Was Lincoln? He was Lincoln's law clerk. But the embalming process was expensive. Usually only the well-to-do officers, families could afford to have their loved ones' remains brought back. There's a woman, Gloria May, who I got a lot of this info for. She does tours, Civil War tours of the cemetery. I highly recommend it. She's got a lot of good info on these guys. I mentioned the Cedar Creek battle in Shenandoah Valley. The guy in charge of the Union Army up there was a guy named General Phil Sheridan, who was either born on the ship coming over from Ireland or born in Albany. There's a Sheridan Hollow, Sheridan Avenue. That's named after his family. They didn't stay there long. They moved out west, so Sheridan grew up in Ohio. But he was a West Point grad, and he was a fighting general. He loved to fight. So he was in charge of the Army in Shenandoah Valley, where the 77th was fighting at the Cedar Creek battle. And what happened there was the Confederate Army surprised the Union armies, rushed them before dawn, which happened a lot. The Union was always getting caught off guard. And the Union guys were retreating by the thousands, and there was one regiment standing its ground, and it turned out to be a regiment from upstate New York, the 49th, from Buffalo, commanded by a guy named Bidwell, from a well-to-do family. If you're ever out in Buffalo, there's a Bidwell Parkway, part of the Frederick Olmsted park system. Did Olmsted design this park too? Bidwell winds up getting killed during this action, and the 77th gets sent up to support them. And the commander of the 77th at that time is a guy named Windsor French. So he's put in command of this section, and it was this 49th and the 77th that pretty much held off the Confederate Army, gave the retreating Union guys time to regroup and go back to the front lines. And the guy that helped do that was Sheridan showed up. He heard the firing from 20 miles away, jumped on his horse, rode there, put his hat on his saber. Come on, boys, come on back, fight. So the press loved that, and Sheridan got a lot of the credit for turning that battle around. But actually, it was the guys of the 49th New York and the 77th who really played a good role in that. Here's someone else that was wounded at Spotsylvania Courthouse, a Captain Seth Dale. These are some of his items over at the museum. The museum, they've got a wonderful collection of Civil War items, and like I said, including the battle flags. Here's one of his jackets and one of his haversack, a typical haversack a soldier would carry during campaigns. I mentioned the battle flags. Here's the 77th National Color flank marker. Flank marker is what they would, the guy on the flanks would carry, because during these Civil War battles, the muskets threw up so much smoke from thousands of muskets being fired, you couldn't see. So they wanted something colorful to let the guys know where their commanders were, where their flanks were, so they could just tell where the battle movements were. And the state of New York opened an office called the Bureau of Military Records. And during the war, they started collecting all these flags, the ones that had been damaged, that couldn't be used anymore. And that started our collection that is in existence still to this day. And Windsor French did say, from the beginning to the end of its service, the regiment bore its colors untouched by the hands of the enemy. They were often shattered and torn by shot and shell, often leveled by the death or wounds of the bearers, but they were always kept sacred. Some of these flags in the collection have the blood stains from the guys carrying them. Being a color bearer was a place of honor. But the casualty rate was horrendous, because the enemy's always going to be shooting at the guy carrying the colors. Because if the colors went down, then confusion ensued. It was easier to maybe take that, get that regiment to retreat from the field. Another one of the core group of officers early on who didn't survive the war, Captain Orrin Rugg. Again, this monument is over in Greenwood Cemetery. I don't know for sure if he's actually buried there. Gloria May did some research. She says there's over 300 Civil War veterans buried in that cemetery alone, including several of the bodies of guys that were killed down in Virginia, and they were brought back. This guy might have been one of the last of the 77th to die in the war. In 1864, the siege of Petersburg, Virginia started. Petersburg, Virginia is 20 miles south of Richmond, and a bunch of railroad lines came together there, and those railroad lines brought in food for Richmond, and the Union almost captured it, but the Confederates stopped them, and then siege warfare ensued from June 1864 right to the end of the war, and it was almost like trench warfare that they would see 50 years later in World War I. They would just snipe at each other, they would lob bombs over at each other, and the 77th would have to go in and do siege duty for a few weeks, then they'd be relieved, and in 1865, in March, late March, the siege was still going on, and the Confederates launched an attack on one of the Union forts, and this officer was killed in that initial attack. The attack failed. The Confederates withdrew from Petersburg, which forced Robert E. Lee to now take his army and head into West Virginia, or I should say Western Virginia. So the 77th is part of that army pursuing Lee. They were in the 6th Corps. 6th Corps played a key role in this Appomattox campaign. There was a battle at a place called Sailor's Creek in the first week of April. It's the last real battle of that the Army of Northern Virginia was in. 77th again was there. Our guys were there. And on April 9th, 1865, Lee and Grant meet in Appomattox in this house, and Lee surrenders his army. The guy who owned the house was a guy named McLean. Turns out McLean was originally from Bull Run, Virginia. He owned a plantation there, and the first major battle was fought on his property. So as the war is really heating up, he says, oh, I gotta get my family out of here. So he moves to Western Virginia, to Appomattox. And doesn't the war literally follow him to his doorstep? And Lee surrenders in his living room. And he's telling this story to a couple of correspondents from Union newspapers. And there's a grizzled Union veteran standing by. He hears this and he yells out to his buddies, well, fellas, I guess we can leave this old boy finally alone. He's been through enough. Somebody wrote that down and it got into the newspapers. The rest of the Confederate forces over the next few weeks in April 1865 surrender. War is over. The guys in the 77th start heading north. They get to Richmond, so they do get to see the Confederate capital, or what was the Confederate capital. In late May 1865, there's a grand review of the Union Army, the Western Army and the Eastern Army, right down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Thousands of soldiers, Union soldiers, over 2 days did a review. Grant was there. Andrew Johnson, the president, who was vice president when Lincoln was killed, assassinated. But the 77th was not there. They didn't get there in time. But they were brought up to Washington, D.C. in June and mustered out. Their service was done. By then, the number of original guys was down to like 250, so they were battalion size. They were called the Bemis Battalion by then. Overall, there were 1,500 men who served in the 77th through the course of the war, from November 1861 to the very end. So they came home and resumed their lives, started businesses, started families. One thing they did was they joined with a new organization called the Grand Army of the Republic, a veterans organization, the GAR. This was a predecessor to the VFW and the American Legion. And at the height, they had over 400,000 members, and it became a very powerful lobbying group for veterans and for veterans' widows and orphans, raising money, getting them financial help. And they didn't dissolve almost to 90 years later, when the last member died at 109 years old. There was a local chapter here named the Wheeler Post after the officer who was killed. And they started doing reunions in the early 1870s. And typically the reunions would be held here in Saratoga Springs, but also in Schenectady, also in Schuylerville. And there would be, local newspapers would do stories on these guys, and they would put together a pamphlet, usually every year. And this always interests me. On the left, they would list the battles they were in. all the way from Yorktown in 1862 right up to Appomattox. And song lyrics of the songs they would sing when they marched along. And then this was in one of the pamphlets. This is about 100 years old, even older. And by then, this lost cause theme had arisen. The lost cause, that the South was really fighting for states' rights. They were really fighting for, their financial freedom. And by the way, slavery wasn't that bad. If you've read Gone with the Wind or seen Gone with the Wind, that's the lost cause that they're depicting in there. Well, these guys, these veterans of the 77th, they knew even back then, 100-odd years ago, that was BS. They were there. They fought those people. And you see what this particular booklet said. They said, no way. They fought not only for a lost cause, but for a wrong cause and for a wrong principle invoked by Southern leaders for the purpose of continuing human slavery. For it is an indisputable fact that for many years prior to 1861, the politicians of the South have been making preparations for a revolt, for which the election inauguration of Abraham Lincoln formed the excuse to begin. There's lots of history revisionists, especially down south, that adhere to that lost cause to this day. So anyway. Like I said, these guys would do reunions every year. Here's one that was held in 1918, September 1918. A couple months later, World War I would end, and you can see the number of guys were dwindling by then. These guys are in their 70s and 80s and 90s by then. Another thing the GAR Post did was memorialize their fallen comrades and, pay tribute to their service to their country by putting up monuments. And they first started out as pretty elaborate monuments in places like New York City and Boston. They'd have they'd have monuments that included several soldiers. So they were expensive, but they had more resources in the big cities to pay for this. So what a lot of these towns, smaller towns and villages did, they would order these statues from companies that during the war had made cannons and armaments. So these companies retooled their factories and foundries to make these statues. And there were various designs you could get, sizes, and it was like ordering items from the old Sears catalog. Well, we want this soldier and this design and the pedestal this high. And the most popular, most produced design was a single soldier standing at what they called parade rest, paying tribute to his fallen comrades. And these were mass produced in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. And in September 1875, they dedicated the monument here. The GAR had raised money, this post, for this monument. And initially it was just outside at the intersection is where they put it. You can see all the people that showed up that day for that dedication. And they put a little fence around it. But by 1920, motor vehicles had become a thing. And the steering wasn't real great on those early cars. So people kept running into the base, and the GAR veterans, the ones that were still around, said, all right, enough of that, we got to move that. Am I getting this right, Jamie? And they said, we got to, so they moved it, not even 100 yards, not even maybe 100 feet into the park here. And this particular style, there's hundreds and hundreds of these across the northern states. And I didn't know how, until I was going to mention this earlier, I didn't know about, you pass these things all the time when you're traveling around the Northeast, right? There's one in Boston Spa at the top of their monument is the same guy. So, and that style was called the Silent Sentinel. Another design, popular design, this one was called Defense of the Flag, because you can see this soldier, he's a color bearer. He's got his right hand on the hilt of a sword, and he's clutching the flag, he's protecting the flag, he's probably a sergeant, color sergeant. And this was erected in 1901 by the local GAR post, the Wheeler post. And around that monument are a few dozen burials of Civil War veterans, many of them from the 77th. Here's just some of them. As you can see, 77th, 77th, 77th. And you notice the ages in some of these guys. If the Civil War didn't kill you outright, you had a good chance of living to a ripe old age. When I was with the Associated Press, in conjunction with the 150th anniversary of the end of the war, I'd gotten curious about all these statues and how they came about. So I did some research, and I did a story for Associated Press's National Wire. This story on the left went everywhere. And the photo that we used with the story was taken by a longtime AP photographer, Mike Grohl. And in it, I detailed how these came about, like what I just told you. And one interesting thing was when the South didn't have these statues right off. The South had no money. They were devastated. They had no economy. Nobody had any money. So it was years after the end of the war where the South finally started putting up their version of these single soldiers. And what these northern companies did is they retooled the molds just again to depict a Confederate soldier with what they call a slouch hat, bedrobe across the chest, kind of that iconic look of a Confederate soldier. But when they went to raise money in the South for these statues, there was a group called United Daughters of Confederate Veterans. They would put notices and ads and have stories placed in the local paper saying they were raising money for these statues. And for years, they would never say where they were buying the statues from. Because if people knew they were buying these statues from a Yankee company, weren't nobody going to kick in any money for that. They finally got over that. So anyway, these Confederate versions started popping up, typically places like Virginia, outside the county courthouses. Those large statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Nathan Bedford Forrest on rearing horses, those came much later. And there's reasons why those were put up well into the 19th century, and it's worthy of its own talk. But, and then a few years later, as a lot of you know, our guy was torn down here, was vandalized. So when people and media outlets Googled the Saratoga Civil War statue, the first picture that would pop up is the picture with my story. In fact, the New York Times did call me about, their reporter called me for info on about this. I know he might have called you too. There you go, yeah. I happened to be walking downtown. It was repaired, and I happened to be walking downtown when they were installing it in November 2021, and that was neat, watching how they did that, how they restored the guy, and he's there now. Another story I did for the AP was about the total casualties of the Civil War. The long-running figure was 620,000. Take World War II, World War I, World War II, Korea and Vietnam, add all those casualties, they still don't come up to 620,000. But a lot of people thought that was low. So this demographics professor at the University of Binghamton did a study, looked into it, using old census records from before the war, immediately after the war, all these documents, and he came up with a figure of 750,000. So I did a story on that, and I called around to some Civil War scholars and well-known authors and said, what do you think of this? And one of them, James McPherson, you might know that name, Pulitzer Prize winner, he said, yeah, we always thought that 620,000 was low, but we had no way to really prove it because we were basing it on old records and this and that. And he said, nobody's really arguing it over it. And if you know Civil War buffs, they will argue all day on which general screwed up where, which regiment was the best. And these Civil War scholars said, no, we're not really arguing over this. We think this is 750,000. And as James McPherson, and one of them told me, he said, yeah, maybe that's the reason why it took the South so long to recover, because the casualties and devastation was a lot more than we initially thought. So you'll see stories pop up now still with that 620,000, but it's closer to 750,000. That's both sides. Actually, the Union lost a little more. I forgot what the breakdown is, but the Union actually lost more guys. Like I said, the 77th fought. They went into the war 7 months after the first shots at Fort Sumter and were there right to the end. This is a rundown of their casualties, their losses. And like I said, a lot of this info is right on the New York State Military Museum website. It's a great source. And in the end, 286 deaths. And missing, and the missing, who knows where they are. They buried guys in mass graves, unmarked graves. Once in a great while, they will find somebody on one of these Civil War battlefields. I did a story on a New York soldier they found in Antietam about 10, 12 years ago. Brought him home for burial, and there was a big ceremony. So, and that is those are the men of the brothers of the 77th. 48 minutes, 48. Anybody, any questions? Or hey, John?
What was the average soldier like in the 77th? Was he a farm boy from just the region around here? What was his story?
From what I could see in these records were, guys from the farms, the rural parts, places like Mechanicville, which even then had manufacturing. People who worked in town here, worked at hotels. The ages range from teenagers right up into the 30s. And some regiments had guys in their 40s, and people are like, well, how could a guy in his 30s and 40s? All I know is people were in better shape back then. You know, they walked everywhere. Guys in their 30s were, like I said, were either working farm work or manufacturing, or you're working a canal boat, or you're doing something active. There were, no TVs, no phones back then. So the guys tended to be in better shape. And if they weren't, they got in shape. If they were overweight, they lost that weight. It wasn't uncommon for these guys, north and south, to march 20 miles a day in the southern heat, in wool uniforms, and then fight a battle. And they would do that day after day after day. So, and the typical guy was, like I said, there were guys as young as 14, 15 in the frontline troops. There were a lot of immigrants, Irish, German, Swiss, Italian. A lot of them formed their own regiments. A great source for that, I think, is Bruce Catton. Is that how you say his name? Bruce Catton has a book on that details what these guys were like, the typical union guys, and they ran a good amount of economics, poor, middle class, very wealthy. Like I said, a lot of the officers came from well-off families, and they didn't have to serve, but most of them did. What else? Yes. You know who I mentioned, that Gloria May, who does the cemetery tours, and she provided me a lot of info. When I brought up some of this info, which she didn't know and she used, she had said that. She said, our guy at the 77th is, she kidded, his name is designed after my boyfriend, Windsor French. She loved Windsor French after learning about him, and he was a good-looking guy. What I learned from doing that story was they purposely, most of them didn't resemble anybody. They did not want them to be a specific soldier. This was the first time in history that I know of where the rank and file guys were being honored. Up until the Civil War, if there was a statue of a military figure, it was George Washington on a horse. It was in Europe, it was Napoleon. It was Lord Wellington, the victor at Waterloo. It was, you know what I'm saying? It was Admiral Nelson. And so they purposely, these designers, they wanted to make it kind of not anonymous. I mean, everybody had facial hair, so a lot of these statues, they have goatees or mustaches. The guy out here has got a mustache. So no, I hated to break it to Gloria. I said, no, I don't think it's you know what I mean? It's more generic. They wanted it that way. And like I said, these statues didn't start, these solitary statues were first placed in cemeteries. So they purposely aren't shown charging or shooting. They're honoring their fallen comrades. On some of the battlefields, you'll see sculptures of depicting battles.